Well, now to our first conversation. It's all about inflation globally right now. And Africa's most populous country, Nigeria, soared to 16.8% in April, talking about headline inflation. Annual food inflation rose to 18.4% from 17.2% in March, sending the headline rate to 16.8%. That's the highest level we've seen in about 8 months. Let's drill down on these numbers now with Damilola Olukono, analyst at Chapel Hill Denham. Great to have you on the show, Damilola.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ladi.
Yeah, so it's all about inflation right now. That is the major elephant in the room. All central bankers trying to bring down, inflation at this point. But we're seeing the numbers now. What are the drivers of this uptick we saw in headline inflation in April?
Yeah, thank you very much. Headline inflation has been ticking up over the last 3 months. The major driver of April's uptick in inflation, was largely driven by pressures coming from the food basket of the inflation, specifically, due to the higher diesel costs, the higher energy prices, that trickles down to higher transportation costs, which continue to mount pressure on commuting costs, from the producing state, down to the cities where these food items are produced. And secondly, due to the onset of the Ramadan, historically, we always witness pressure on food inflation, the month preceding the Ramadan, which was what played out in the month of April. And the insecurity situation as well in the north, still continues to mount pressure on food inflation. And overall, that was what drove the uptick in headline inflation, we saw in the month of April.
Right, and globally, we're seeing inflation hit new highs, in the U.S. and the UK, and most of it is energy induced. That's what most analysts have said. So I'm wondering, Damilola, let's say the oil price, crashes down. Will we see inflation tick down at some point?
Yeah, if the oil price, comes down, we would see an ease in the core basket of the inflation, which is where the energy prices, affect the most. But like I mentioned, inflation in Nigeria, is driven by the food side of things, and that would need to see more structural measures, put in place, to combat the inflation we are seeing on the food side. One is insecurity, the other one has to do with transportation infrastructures, and lastly, the one that has to do with energy costs, which is trying to reduce the cost of transportation. But then globally, the ongoing rift between Russia and Ukraine, has also led to higher energy prices. As you are aware that Russia is a big exporter of crude oil. So the pressure going on that front, continues to impact energy prices, and that was what has led to the spiraling global inflation, we continue to see. So yes, if energy prices, decline on a global scale, that would lead to decline, in inflation, particularly for net importers of petroleum products, like Indonesia, Germany, and the likes. But then in Nigeria, we need to see more than a decline in energy price to see an ease in headline inflation going forward.
Right, it's quite interesting. But, the hike in inflation means the purchasing power of, Nigerian consumers, some of whom live on a minimum wage of about 18,000 per month, is being eroded. And salary earners, are said to be hit the most with all of this. But what do you think can be done, at this point for some kind of soft landing?
Yeah, what can be done? To provide soft landing, for the end users or for the consumers in the street, is what I already mentioned. Part of it is what I already mentioned before. One, we need to reduce our reliance, on imported product, because what we find is some of the pressures, we saw in the inflation basket is coming from the imported inflation side of things, which would mean that when you see spiraling prices on the global front, we tend to bear the brunt, in the domestic landscape. So if we can see increased production of food items and less reliance on imported products, I think that will douse some of the concerns, we are seeing on the inflation front. And secondly, if the CBN is able to solve some of the concerns, on the FX front, we would also see ease to consumer wallet. Because what you currently find is most producing companies, have increased prices, on the back of the cost inflation, we've seen to raw materials, basic raw materials, they used in producing their product. So if we see some sort of measures put in place, to combat FX problems, then that could also lead to improved consumer wallet as well.
Right, and inflation in Nigeria was already on the way up before the war in Ukraine. But how big of an impact is the ongoing face-off between Russia and Ukraine on Nigeria's inflation?
Yeah, it's in some sense we are being impacted, especially when you look at the fact that about 80% of Nigeria's FX revenue comes from oil. And like I mentioned, because Russia is a big exporter of crude oil, the shortage in supply, coming on that front has left crude oil prices, elevated. So Nigeria is largely impacted, from that standpoint. And for other commodities as well, Russia is also a big producer of wheat. And Nigeria is also somewhat a big consumer of wheat-related products. The likes of flour mills, Olam, Dufil, have all raised prices, on the back of the pressures coming from Russia's inability to supply adequate wheat, to the global market. So Nigeria has been largely affected by the ongoing rift, between Russia and Ukraine. And if this crisis, continues over a long period of time, we will see further pressures, emanating from that front.
Yeah, and a lot of warning about global hunger at this point. But, MPC meeting is coming. How will the inflation reading affect the outcome of the MPC meeting holding next week? Are we going to see changes to the MPC parameters?
Yeah, for us, we think the Monetary Policy Committee, is faced with a very difficult situation, like I like to call it, because on the one hand, we are beginning to see monetary tightening, on the global front. Already, the U.S. Fed already raised interest rates, multiple times this year, and they have also guided to raising interest rates, further as we go into the year. Same thing with the Eurozone as well. The ECB has also guided to raising interest rates. So in developed markets, we are beginning to see elevated interest rates. And in some sense, that has also led to capital flight, in emerging markets, of which Nigeria appears to be a player in that space. So on the one hand, the monetary policy is faced with that problem. And on the other hand, again, locally, we are also seeing inflationary worries as well. For the third consecutive month, we saw uptick in headline inflation. And in fact, inflation even rose to an 8-month high. So when you also look at things from that perspective as well, I think that will be an important consideration, in formulating their policies, ahead of the next MPC meeting as well. One of their major excuses, for not keeping interest rate elevated, has been economic growth. And for some time, we've seen stability on that front. Nigeria's economic growth, has improved from the COVID pandemic lows, we saw in 2020. So for us, we think the stage seems set for an elevation in the MPR rate. albeit we guide that we might not see that come to play at next week's MPC meeting. And at the next MPC meeting in July, we think if the economic parameters, remains the same, it will be a good time, for the MPC to leave to raise their MPR rate. We are guiding to a 25 basis point to a 50 basis point hike, by then.
Right, and we've seen the U.S. Fed, raise rates about a couple of times, about 50 basis points. And, looking at Nigeria's situation, do you think the MPC have, something in their arsenal that can actually realistically fight inflation at this point?
Bulk of Nigeria's inflation, is largely structural compared to what you have in the domestic market. Where their inflation, is demand pull. For us here, inflation is cost push, and to combat that type of inflation, you would need to put structural measures in place, as against using the traditional way of combating, using the traditional way of using monetary policy to combat inflation. So alongside maybe an hike in MPR rate. For us, we would like to see structural changes, in the FX front. Like I mentioned, compared to the highs, we used to have before, FX liquidity appears frail, and that continues to mount pressure on the naira. So if we can see the CBN, come up with policies, to improve FX liquidity and to make FX, available to investors who are willing to come in and out of the country, then we think those kind of measures, would be a more viable way, to combat inflation. And secondly, as well, infrastructure is also a major determinant as well. Commuting costs, are highly susceptible to various shocks, and if we can get our infrastructure right as well, we think it will go a long way, it will go a long way in ensuring that our inflation is subdued, and it will make inflation, more manageable than it is today. So, in summary, as against using monetary policy tools like increasing the MPR rate, we will need to see more policy directives, that would create or lead to lasting changes, in the economy.
Right. Not an easy time for central bankers all over the world, I must say, Damilola. But, what's the impact on fixed income yields, going forward, and how will this affect the outcome of, the subsequent primary market auction?
Okay. The impact for fixed income yields, it's a bit direct. For us, coming into 2022, we are guided to an elevated fixed income yield. That's largely coming from the lower maturity profile, as against what we had in the prior years. And when you now overlay that with the fact that inflation rates, are on the uptick, that just provides leeway, for further spike, in fixed income yields. And that's what we've seen, come to fruition. The last few bond auctions, has delivered higher stop rates. And we think this will be the case, going forward, especially when you factor in the fact, like I mentioned before, factor in the fact that the liquidity in the system, is somewhat lower, compared to where it used to be before. So we think the stage seems set for an elevated fixed income yield, and we think investors or market participants, should position, ahead of further spikes in fixed income yields.
Quite interesting. But what is the outlook for inflation going forward? And when do we see, inflation peaking or moderating?
Okay. For us, we think going forward, we might still see further spike in inflation, particularly on the food side of things. the drivers of the elevated inflation numbers, we saw in April are still pretty much around. The insecurity situation in the north, is still persisting. And we are still seeing the pass-through of higher energy prices, on transportation costs. So for us, we think the outlook for headline inflation, is for it to go up further. And in terms of when we think it will peak, we think there is still scope for elevated energy costs, which would still mount further pressure on inflation. So for us, when we start seeing crude oil prices, moderate to decent levels, maybe below $80 per barrel, then we think it would be a good time, or we think that would provide, leeway for further downtrend in inflation.
Right.
But from where we see it, we think there is still room for further spike in inflation.
Right. Everyone's looking for that that peaking point for inflation. Thanks so much, Damilola Lookman, analyst at Chapel Hill Dynamos. Great having you on the program.
Thank you for having me.